what you want from me. I make you. I create you best to wear. I put you way up high in the air. And you go fly back home to us. And I say, no, devil, you lie. You come to me. Stormy night, like say, did you want love? I ask, white people belong to.
All right, now we're in Wikipedia. All right, as you see, it says Tituba was an enslaved woman owned by Samuel Parris of Danvers, Massachusetts. Although her origins are debated, they're debated, right? Research has suggested that she was a South American native. If you actually do research, you'll see that she was actually a South American native and sailed from Barbados to New England with Samuel Parris. Tituba was the first to be accused of practicing witchcraft during the 1692 Salem Witch Trials. Little is known regarding Tituba's life prior to her enslavement. However, she became a pivotal figure in the witch trials when she confessed to witchcraft, while also making claims that both Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne participated in said witchcraft. She was imprisoned and later released by Samuel Conkling, but little to nothing is known about Tituba's life following her subsequent release. Alright, so this is the image that Wikipedia has of Tituba, and it's actually a historical image drawn from some famous sketch they did, I guess, back in those times. I just want you to notice the two feathers on her head, right? The two feathers. She's an American Indian. See how they try to make her look like a witch, right? Says here, early life and accusations against her. Tituba's husband was John Indian. All right, we're gonna read that's false. All right, it might have been her nephew or actually a family member or somebody from her tribe. A Native American man whose origins are unknown, but he may have been from Central America. Tituba as well may have been originally from Central America before Barbados. There are arguments made that Tituba was African American, but this has been contradicted by historians. All right, it's contradicted because there's another truth, including Elaine Bresla, who partially blames Charles Upham, who got false information from Samuel Drake for the confusion. Possibly she was born in Barbados, but regardless, she was a descendant of captives on the island. Her husband went on to become one of the accusers in the witch trial. They appeared documented together in Samuel Parris Church record book. All right, we're in this website fandom. It says here Salem Wiki. All right, talking about Tituba. This is a depiction right from the show. All right, and just go down here real quick. It says early life. It says originally from the Arawak tribe. Tituba was born and raised in a South American village before she was abducted from her homeland and sold into slavery. All right, so who was being sold into slavery? An American India. Tituba explained how the Europeans invaded her village and murdered most of the men who lived there. So they Europeans, right? Who we talking about? Probably we're talking about either Spaniards or English invading South American Indian village, right? Not an African village, right? And murdering most of the men who lived there, including her father, before the Europeans brought Tituba to the New World. The Puritans forced Tituba to watch as they raped her mother and sisters. Tituba claims that she too would have been raped had she not have been a child. All right, so we're in this website called New England Folklore, a blog, right, site, and it says, how did Tituba become black? Tituba is one of the key figures in the Salem Witch Trials, a slave owned by Reverend Parris of Salem Village. She was one of the first people accused of being a witch. She was also one of the first people to accuse others of witchcraft while she was on the stand. I think it's well known these days that ethnically, Tituba was an Arawak Indian. All right, so is it well known these days? Is this a true statement? Did you guys know, honestly, that Tituba, or the so-called slave or Negro woman that was accused of being a witch, that basically was forced to admit or that she was a witch and blame others as well for witchcraft, was an Arawak Indian? Did you know that? Is this well known these days? Reverend Parris and his family had lived as plantation owners for many years in the Caribbean, the Arawak homeland. It seems likely that Parrises purchased Tituba and her husband John as slaves while living in Barbados. Although historians know that Tituba was an Indian, pop culture tends to portray her as being of African descent. Pop culture, it's not real. Pop culture tends to portray her as being African descent. It's not real. It's just pop culture. All right. She was an Indian. For example, on the TV show Salem, Titu was played by a black actress and speaks with a Caribbean accent. For many years, I also thought she was black, based on what I had learned when I was a kid. History of Massachusetts blog, all right, or .org says Tituba, the slave of Salem. Right, says Tituba was a slave who worked for Samuel Parris during the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. The various documents and books about the Salem Witch Trials over the years often refer to Tituba as a black or mixed race, but the actual court documents from her trial refer to her as an Indian woman servant. All right, we're not talking about slave, we're talking about an indentured servant. Remember? All right, let's not forget that. We got the past videos already, all right? She was an Indian woman servant. Tituba's early life, it says here. Not much is known about Tituba's life except that she was born in an Arawak village in South America, where she was captured during her childhood and taken to Barbados as a slave. So again, who are these Europeans enslaving or putting into servitude? Not Africans. All right? They're taking whole villages. She's one of them. All right? And they're bringing them to Barbados. All right, this is the 1600s, and they keep telling us that these are Africans arriving in Barbados, these so-called Negroes, because we know she's so-called black, right? They just said it as black, so-called black. All right, so again, we're just gonna keep repeating things over and over, and you're gonna see it's all leading to one truth. Paris or an associate later purchased her in Barbados when she was a teenager and brought her to Boston in 1680. In November of 1689, Samuel Parris moved Tituba and his family to Salem after he was appointed the new minister of Salem village. All right, now we're about to go into this book. It's called Tituba of Salem Village. All right, check it out. Tituba of Salem Village. See how they draw her right here? All right, this is the cover of the book. Again, Tituba of Salem Village by Anne Petrie. And it begins right here, right in chapter 1 of this book. All right, it says, there was nothing to indicate to the slave Tituba that this morning in November would be unlike other mornings she had known in Bridgetown. The sun was out. The island of Barbados lay like a jewel sparkling in the sea. Its yellow-white coral-encrusted coastline blazed in the brilliant light. Tituba could see part of the shoreline from the windows of Susanna Endicott's kitchen, because the house sat on the edge of Carlisle Bay, just where it made a wide inward curve. It says here, the slave John, Tituba's husband, dodged a hijack. All right, remember, Tituba means auntie. Had been fishing, and he was showing her the red snappers he had caught. He had carried them to the kitchen in a big hand-woven basket. The basket was a deep, dark brown, almost as dark as his hands. As dark as his hands. So what is that? He's a Negro, right? All right, remember they said he was also an American Indian. Remember that. John the Indian, right? John the Indian, right? So he has deep, dark brown hands. And the fish as he took them out of the basket were silvery by contrast. He had covered the fish with leaves to keep them cool. Good eating, John said, holding one of the big fish up for Tituba's inspection. He was a tall, powerfully built man with broad shoulders. He wore only a pair of white cotton trousers, rolled up to the knees. He was barefooted. He leaned over the basket and then straightened up with a fluid, easy movement that made the muscles on his back ripple on the dark brown skin, He smiled, and his face, which had looked dark and severe in repose, was lightened and brightened by the smile. Tituba took one of the big fish in her hands and laughed. It feels like I was holding a long wiggle, she said, and dropped the fish in the basket. She was short compared to John, but she held herself so erect that she looked taller than she really was. Her magnificent posture was due to the fact that she liked to carry baskets balanced on her head like the market women. Her hair was completely covered by a neatly wound white turban. A turban. She was wearing a pale blue cotton dress. The sleeves were rolled above her elbows, revealing sturdy arms. The skin, a smooth, dark brown. The skin, a smooth, dark Brown. Again, TITUBA the American Indian Arawak that was accused of being a witch in the Salem Witch Trials. Her skin is a smooth, dark, brown, so-called Negro person, right? She was also barefooted too, it says. All right, so just wanted to show this real quick from this book so you can see who we're talking about. All right, so now we're in this book. It's called Tituba, Reluctant Witch of Salem, Devilish Indians. What? They're calling you devil again. Devilish Indians and Puritan Fantasies by Elaine G. Breslaw. All right, Tituba. Now we're gonna get into part one, right? Real quick, right? It says Barbados, right? Tituba's roots, an Arawak from Guyana, Guyana, Guinea, Guinea, land of the Negroes, Guyana, my own country, Tituba in Barbados, strange new world, an American Indian on a Barbados plantation. All right. So first of all, I just want to say, if you read this book, if you take the time to go look for it and read it or buy it, whatever, you're gonna see how she actually went into the census records, historical societies in Barbados, in Massachusetts. She did very thorough investigation. All right, you got to read the introduction, you got to read all the sources that she quotes from. All right, this is real history right here. This is real research. This is not suggestions or opinions or theories. She really found out who this person was, and she knows it's an Arawak American Indian. All right, let's go read what she has to say. All right, so real quick in the introduction of the book, it says, as expected, the biographical information about Tituba in the Salem documents is very thin. Nevertheless, some important information can be extracted from these meager sources. It is clearly evident from all references in those written records that Tituba was an American Indian and not African, as later writers have assumed, and that she and her husband John, also an American Indian, were slaves living in the household of the Reverend Samuel Parris. So dodge the hijack with slaves, they were servants. There is no reference anywhere in the 17th century documents to Tituba as an African. Again, my people. All right. Again, Senada. Again, Garfield. There is no reference anywhere in the 17th century documents to Tituba as an African or as someone of African background, like the mythology of Tituba as a voodoo priestess. There is no indication in the extant records that either Tituba or her husband had African ancestry. None of her contemporaries saw her as an African or even someone of mixed ancestry. She was never described as black or as Negro. Nowhere in the 17th century records is there so much as a hint that she was of an even partial African descent. Thus, there should be no question of her ancestry. All of her contemporaries, without exception, describe Tituba as an Indian woman or as Paris Indian servant, a servant. All right, so what does contemporaries mean? Meaning people who lived at the same time as her. So the records from those times when she was alive, real records, real historical records, all agree, all say the same thing, that Tituba was an Indian woman, right? And she was actually, unfortunately, Paris' Indian servant. Her husband John's racial ethnic background is just as clearly delineated in those records. He is always identified as Indian John or John Indian, or simply as the Indian man. The gradual metamorphosis of Tituba from an Indian to an African since the 19th century is an unfortunate mistake based on embellishment. Again, Tituba from an Indian to an African since the 19th century is an unfortunate mistake based on embellishment, imagination, and a tinge of racial bias, and has been a convenient way to fill in blanks left by the absence of more substantive information. What is less clear from those 17th century commentaries is where Tituba came from, how and when Paris acquired her, and what kind of intellectual and cultural baggage she brought with her to Massachusetts. The most reasonable theory for Tituba's origins was first put forward by Charles Upham, written in the middle of the 19th century. Tituba and John were spoken of, Upham said, as having come from New Spain. That is, the Spanish West Indies, all right, New Spain, the Spanish West Indies, and the adjacent mainland. They were then sold in Barbados as slaves and subsequently brought to Massachusetts by Samuel Parris. Upham offered no direct evidence, but because a good part of his narrative was based on Samuel Drake's work, he probably made use of Drake's edition of Samuel Fowler's 1866 account of life of Samuel Parris, in which Fowler claimed that Tituba and John were natives of South America called New Spain, Tituba's roots, and Arawak from Guyana. Alright? Says they are spoken of as having come from New Spain, as it was then called, that is, the Spanish West Indies, and the adjacent mainland of Central and South America. Charles Upham, Salem Witchcraft. Alright, you hear this? In July of 1674, Captain Peter Roth, lately of Kent in England, set sail from Barbados on his sloop, Sonoy, bound for the northeast coast of South America. His mission was to locate and kidnap American Indians. What was his mission? To locate and kidnap American Indians to sell as slaves in Barbados, and as an incidental part of the trip, to trade with friendly Indians. The vessel, propelled by the easterly trade winds, sailed generally south-southwest for 300 miles past Trinidad to the Orinoco River Delta on the coast of South America. A starboard turn to a more westerly course brought them up the Orinoco to one of its tributaries, the Amacuda River, Amarucan, Amaruca River, their chosen destination. This word, America, is not from Amerigo Vespucci. That's a future video, my people. I got the whole truth. His name wasn't even Amerigo. It was Albert. It was Alberigo. Alright, but that's a whole different subject. I just want to show you that these words were actually already here. Sailing southeast to the Amacuda, the crew spied canoes carrying 14 Indians who were invited on board to trade. As some of the men bargained with the Indians, Rolfe decided to permit the peaceful trade. They were, he assured his ship's masters, William Price, of the wrong tribe to kidnap, probably Carib. They were protected by the English king's orders to maintain friendly relations with the enemies of the Dutch settlers. The continuing hostility between the Caribs and the Dutch in America encouraged the English monarch to woo the Carib or Carib allied tribes as potential allies in the continuing Anglo-Dutch conflict. So you see that? They left the Caribs alone during this time because they were actually helping the English, or they were at war with the Dutch, right? Too, like the English. Maybe they weren't just helping them, maybe they were just fighting for themselves, but the English liked that, so they left them alone, all right? So, meaning they were actually looking for a specific tribal people, which were Arawaks. Entrepreneurs like Rolfe, encouraged by Barbados Governor Lord Willoughby and his successor in 1673, Sir Peter Colleton, to raid and spy on Dutch colonies, had seized the opportunity to kidnap Indian allies of the Dutch, particularly Arawak-related tribes. Rolfe had erred during previous escapades when he had attempted to establish a trade in Indian slaves and had captured Caribs, who were under the protection of the English king. The entrepreneur had been ordered to desist and return the captive Caribs to the South American coast. But in the summer of 1674, Rolfe was determined to find tribes that lacked sufficient European support to cause diplomatic or military reprisals. On the 2nd of August, 8 women and 2 children approached the Sonoy with more trade goods. The 2 were welcomed aboard. Again, Rolfe consulted his crew. This time, the men agreed they had likely captives, and they devised a plan to kidnap the women and children. Some of the crew were told to guard the Indians' canoes and be prepared to pursue those who resisted. Rolfe grabbed the first woman and his crew seized 3 more and the children. In the confusion, 4 women were able to jump overboard. They frantically began to swim away. Rolfe, anticipating that the women would resist and familiar with the swimming ability of the local Indians, ordered his men to paddle the canoes to catch the runaways. The women swam gracefully and swiftly with heads under the water, but they were no match for the speed of the canoes. The men set off immediately, caught up with the women, and the fleeing swimmers were brought back to the sloop. Satisfied with their successes and still on the alert, the crew waited for the tide to turn. As it ebbed, the Sonoy sailed down the Amacuda River northward into the Orinoco and out of the Atlantic. Within a month, they arrived back in Barbados with their booty of trade goods and 10 captive Indians to sell into slavery. Immediately upon landing in Bridgetown, the main port in Barbados, William Price, the master of the vessel, entered his deposition on September 2nd, 1674, to prove that the captured Indians were not a friendly tribe protected by any treaty. Price suggested that they were Arawak Indians or from an Arawak-related tribe, known to be allied with the Dutch and therefore vulnerable to English attacks. Roth and Price brought their captives to Barbados to satisfy what they perceived as a potential market for American Indian household slaves. The fact that the captives were women was, therefore, no mere accident. The enterprising Peter Roth seemed determined to supply Indian women to substitute for the declining number of English house servants arriving on Barbados shores. All right, so what did they do to basically substitute the declining number of the English servants? They didn't get Africans. What were they planning? To get American Indian women to substitute these English house servants. The experience of those 8 women and 2 children goes far to explain TITUBA's presence in Barbados. Charles Upham's report in the 19th century that according to local legend, TITUBA and her husband John were spoken of as having come from New Spain, that is, the Spanish West Indies, and the adjacent mainland, is born out of the record of known slave capturing activities in South America. Peter Roth ventures are evidence of an existing, albeit small, slave trade. All right, an existing evidence of an existing, and they try to say small, but it wasn't small. We already know that, right? We got the past videos, right? So, evidence of an existing slave trade between the South American coast, identified at the time as the Spanish Main and Barbados. All right, so the Spanish were bringing what? American Indians. They had a slave trade going on, a real slave trade going on here. All right, with American Indians. All right, from the Spanish mainland and Barbados. It is there on the northeast coast of South America, in present-day Venezuela, that Tituba, the Indian slave woman, probably had her beginnings. Within a few years of the arrival of the English, a small group of Arawaks had been persuaded to move to Barbados from the Guiana coast of South America to teach the islanders how to grow appropriate crops. Man, over and over, you see how your ancestors, the ancestors, helped these Europeans survive, right? So again, who did they bring over to help them grow crops? Not Africans. What did they do? They went to the Guyana coast, Guyana, Guinea, Guyana. All right, wordplay here. There's a little wordplay here going on. We have to dig on that. All right, land of Negroes, the land of Negroes on the coast of South America, to teach the islanders how to grow appropriate crops. American Indians, subsequently enslaved, those Arawaks were by the 1650s either dead or they and their descendants had been returned to the mainland. Thereafter, until the 1660s, Indian slaves, when acquired, were usually a result of warfare with the other Europeans in the West Indies. During the 17th century, the intricacies of British policy vis-a-vis the Spanish, French, and Dutch had dictated which Caribbean Indians were most vulnerable to capture and enslavement. Sporadically, as hostilities among the European rivals rose and fell during the 17th century, Amerindian captives, all right, Amerindian captives, not Africans, were brought from Jamaica, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Dominica to Barbados and enslaved. All right, so you see, Amerindian captives, not Africans. Given the pattern of the slave trade in that area of the West Indies and the structure of Anglo-Dutch relations, it seems reasonable to conclude that Tituba and most of other Amerindian slaves living in Barbados during the 1670s probably came from one of the Arawak-related tribes of northeastern South America, that is, from Venezuela or Guyana, the English-speaking country sandwiched between Venezuela and present-day Suriname. Tituba would have been among the small contingent of American Indians forcibly transported to Barbados from the South American coast, the Spanish Main, and shipped to the island no more than 10 years before moving to Massachusetts in 1680. And it says an Arawak Guyana background seems to be the most likely explanation for Tituba's origins. It's the most logical and likely explanation. Not African. Although the evidence is circumstantial, Tituba, transported to Boston 6 years after 1674 kidnapping event, may well have been one of the children in Rob's cargo that September day in 1674. Evidence uncovered in the Barbados records suggests that Tituba was just a child, somewhere between 9 and 14 years old, in 1676. While still a child, she was in all likelihood sold in Barbados as a slave and subsequently brought to Massachusetts by Samuel Parris. And continuing the book, Tituba, Reluctant Witch of Salem, it says, of even more significance is a branch of the Arawaks living in that area of the Amakura River and identified by anthropologists as the Tetebetana. The name Tituba is most likely a Spanish derivative of that Arawak name. Reasonable grounds for assuming South American Arawak roots for the Indian slave woman later brought to Massachusetts. Arawak names had regular endings to indicate sex and number. The collective ending was na or sometimes no. Tetebetana would have been the name of the group itself. The masculine ending was dai or sometimes tai. The feminine was do or to. Thus, a male in the tribe would be called Tetebetadi dai and a female Tetebetado. A Barbados planter hearing this Spanish-sounding name may well have dropped the ending syllable and called a member of the tribe by the name of Tetebe, with its variant spellings including Tituba, Tatuba, and Titeba. And continuing the book, it says, with brownish skin and black hair, brownish skin, ish. Arawaks resembled other Indians of Central America and the Caribbean, just like other Indians, brown skin, just like the ones in Central America and the Caribbean. I'm in the book called An Account of the Life, Character, and of the Reverend Samuel Parris of Salem Village and his connection with the witchcraft delusion of 1692. Read before the Essex Institute, November 14th, 1856, by Samuel P. Fowler. All right, and this is written in 1857. All right, 1857. We got a real historic book here, record. All right, so we're in page 5 of this book, and it says Mr. Parris' household consisted at this time of himself and wife, his age being 39 years, that of his wife 44 years, a daughter Elizabeth, aged 9 years, a niece of 11 years, by the name of Abigail Williams, and 2 servants. Again, 2 servants. Please remember, please look at what I'm showing you. Not slaves, servants. We're talking about indentured servants. Why? Because at this time, that's what they had, indentured servants. Named John Indian, an Indian, and Tituba, his wife, or his relation, or somebody from his tribe he respected and called Auntie. Both natives of South America. American Indians from South America, okay? Then called New Spain. These were held as slaves. They were held as slaves, but they were servants. What does that mean? They had maybe a term of life, just like we talked about how they were extended terms of service to basically life. So, these servants were being held as slaves, and Paris probably came in possession of them in some of his commercial transactions. By some persons, these Indians have been supposed to belong to the aborigines of our country. Aborigines, aborigines of our country, and to have obtained their knowledge of witchcraft from the Indian powwows. Taj the hijack. Right, so 1857, 1856, this is what they're saying about your ancestors because we know how to use herbs to heal each other in our diseases, right? Because we're in tune with nature. All right, so they're calling it aborigine witchcraft, I guess, but they're letting you know straight up, right? Who are these people? These are not Africans. We see the images of her, right? You see all the depictions of her in the movies. All right, what is she? a so-called Negro woman, right? But this is an aborigine of South America, Guyana, Guinea, a land of Negroes. All right, that's what it means. Guyana, Guyana. They're just playing word games with you, flipping the history, flipping it on you, the map, flipping it, reverse. Again, by some papers, these Indians have been supposed to belong to the Aborigines. All right, Aborigines. All right, now we're in this other book. It's called The Wonders of the Invisible World, displayed in 5 parts. All right, it says here collected by Robert Califf, merchant of Boston in New England, a new edition, Boston, published by T. Benlington in 1828. 1828. All right, we're in page 197 of this book, and dodge the hijack. So it says a few days before this solemn day of prayer, Mr. Paris, Indian man and woman, Indian Aborigine, Arawak man and woman made a cake of rye meal, it says here, with the children's water, and baked it in the ashes, and as it said, gave it to the dog. This was done as a means to discover witchcraft. All right, soon after which those ill affected or afflicted persons named several that they saw when in their fits afflicting them. All right, so this is like, the whole story of the Salem Witch Trials. So it says the first complaint of was the said Indian woman named Tituba. The Indian woman named Tituba, she was the first complained of. She confessed that the devil urged her to sign a book, which he presented to her, and also to work mischief to the children. She was afterwards committed to prison, and lay there till sold for her fees. The account she since gives of it is that her master did beat her and other ways abuse her to make her confess and accuse such as he called her sister witches. Alright, so you hear what's going on? There's a whole other story after this. There's accounts of her confessing, stating later on that he had beat her, and abused her so she can get this confession out of her. So this guy, Robert Paris, the Reverend, beating, come on, Reverend, he had like an agenda, kind of, right? These people, a lot of them were, almost all of them were innocent, right? He had an agenda with this, and he used Tituba. He used who? The Indian Arawak Aborigine Tituba, all right, to get people killed. And that whatsoever she said by way of confessing or accusing others was the effect of such usage. She only did it because he was abusing her. Her master refused to pay her fees unless she would stand to what she had said. So, because she didn't want to admit or keep lying because she was telling the truth, he didn't bail her out or anything. All right. All right. So we're again in Wikipedia. All right. For Tituba. Again, look at the image. She got 2 feathers on. She's rocking the feathers. They make her look like a witch, a weird. And you know how they try to make them look witches like old ladies and stuff, whatever. All right. So down here it says after the trials, Tituba remained in jail because Samuel Paris refused to pay her jail fees. In April of 1693, Tituba was sold to an unknown person for the price of her jail fees. An interview with Robert Califf. This is the guy we just read, the author from the book. There we go, look. This is the book we just read from. For his collections on papers on the trials titled Wonders of the Invisible World, being an account of the trials of several witches lately executed in New England. So he interviewed her. Tituba confirmed that Paris had beaten a confession out of her and then coached her in what to say and how to say when first questioned. You see what he did? All right, you see what he did? All right, now look what it says here. It says fiction. And look how they show her right here like a gypsy, like a old, like a for real, like a witch, right? The majority of fictional pieces that artistically or historically depict Tituba's life portray her as an other or an outgroup. You hear this? By Puritan society. That's still how they treat you. Due to her racial and socioeconomic status as a South American native indigenous and as an indentured servant woman. All right, what have we been learning? Your ancestors were first indentured servants, put into terms of service for a contract of years, and eventually, what happened? Their terms of service were extended to life terms. All right, so she was an outcast basically because of her racial and socioeconomic status as a South American native indigenous and an indentured servant woman. Indentured servant woman. You can take a look at this at Double Portrait TITUBA, Racism and Politics, International Journal of Language Academy. Alright, well look what we got here. We actually have that journal. International Journal of Language Academy, it says here, Volume 1. Double Portrait TITUBA, Racism and Politics by Deciphering TITUBA. Alright, that's some weird language right there, right? Polish or something? What is that, huh? It says racism as a social discourse has permanently been treated by the American writers, critics, politicians, intellectuals, and has often made American political and social history quite busy. Racist attitudes and policies have sometimes led to the formation of a variety of reactions, and have been most of the time turned into political material and ultimately has invaded the American literature. This study examines how racist discourse and behaviors are reflected on the works of two different authors, and how these reflections are interpreted. Anne Petrie, in her novel Tituba of Salem Village, introduces a black woman. What? A so-called what? Black? Who's black? Who they call black? But remember, this is an aborigine, right? An indigenous woman from South America. So she's being introduced as a black woman who appears intelligent but sometimes foolish, brave but sometimes a victim, a stranger but a survivor, a slave but at the same time a black heroine. In a way, Tituba reflects a self-resistant portrayal of women, with her strong desire to survive and her versatile aspects as a good and skilled black woman. Tituba is the main character in the Petrie's Tituba of Salem Village, 1956, portraying Tituba as a black West Indian who tells stories about life in Barbados to the village girls. Petrie mingles these stories with existing superstitions and half-remembered pagan beliefs among the Puritans, and she also represents the hysteria that surrounds witchcraft. All right, so she's portrayed as what? As a black West Indian. All right, what does that mean? She's indigenous. She's an aborigine from South America, Arawak. All right, now continue and look at this. Now we're gonna get into the hijack right here. Let's expose the hijack right here. It says, as an Afro-American writer, Afro, dodge the hijack. Petrie introduces a black character, so-called black, who is harshly accused of deeds linked with the devil, which she has basically nothing to do with. Although the novel reflects the period, Tituba is not characterized simply as a witch, but more especially is portrayed as a what? Black slave. We're just talking about you when we're talking about American Indian or Aborigines of America, especially that area of South America, the Amazons, Orinoco, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname. This is land of the Negroes. That's why they call it Guyana. Guyana. Petrie shows us a character who is regarded as a potential criminal merely because of her skin color. So what happened? She was an outcast, remember? Because of her racial status and because she was an indentured servant. So they used her. He was beating her. He beat her to confess that she was a witch because of her skin color. But we're talking about an American Indian woman, right? An Arawak. Although Tituba, along with her husband John, does what her master orders her to do. She did what her master ordered beat her to do. She is always at the mercy of some accusation or another. Alright, now we're in the Smithsonian.com website, and we're in this article. It says here, unraveling the many mysteries of Tituba, the star witness of the Salem Witch Trials. Says no one really knows the true motives of the character, central to one of America's greatest secrets. greatest secrets. I wonder what that secret is. Hmm. Says here the pivotal accuser at the trial, Tituba, would go down in history as a purveyor of satanic magic. So this is how they want to portray your ancestor. Just because she was an American indigenous woman, she was an outcast, and that's how they portrayed her. And 1880s engraving depicts her in the act of terrifying children. Look at that, how they depict her. All right, so this is by Stacy Schiff, Smithsonian Magazine. All right. We know her only as Tituba. She belonged to Samuel Parris, the minister in whose household the witchcraft erupted. His daughter and niece were the first to convulse. Although she was officially charged with having practiced witchcraft on 4 Salem girls between January and March, we do not know precisely why Tituba was accused. Especially close to 9-year-old Betty Parris, she had worked and prayed alongside the family for years, for at least a decade in Boston and Salem. She took her meals with the girls, beside whom she likely slept at night. Tituba may have sailed from Barbados, we already know she did, in 1680, not may have, with Paris, then still a bachelor. He wasn't a reverend yet, he was a bachelor, and not yet a minister, though likely a South American Indian. Not likely. She was an aborigine. She was an indigenous Arawak, indigenous woman. All right. It says her origins are unclear. Yeah, Smithsonian. Keep lying. It continues, says she could not have expected to be accused. New England witches were traditionally marginals, outliers and deviants, cantankerous scolds and choleric foot stompers. So people who were like the lower class society. They were not people of color. She's a person of color. Just saying, wishes usually were not the Negroes. That's what they're saying. People of color, which she is. All right, now look what it says here. It says there would be less consensus afterward, particularly when it came to Tituba's identity. Described as Indian no fewer than 15 times in the court papers. All right, as Indian. She went on to shift shape herself. All right, how did she do that? All right, remember, she's a person of color. They already said that earlier. But she's described as an Indian in the court papers, legal papers. All right, as scholars have noted, fallen prey to multi-century game of telephone, Tituba evolved over 2 centuries from Indian, like your ancestors, and this is what happened to you too, your ancestors. Listen, from Indian to half black to black. They call you black today. They call you black today. This is, I would say, 95 to 98% of so-called African Americans. They call you black today. With assist from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who seemed to have plucked her from Macbeth, historian George Bancroft and William Carlos Williams, by the time Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible in 1952, Tituba was a Negro slave. A Negro. Dodge the hijack. Remember, Negro and slave were synonymous. They were calling anybody who was a slave Negro. Indians were slaves too, right? They were called Negro too because they were synonymous. All right. She engaged in a different brand of dark arts to go with her new heritage. To go with her new heritage. So they started adding the African and the voodoo and all that to these stories. All right. This didn't really happen. Miller supplied a live frog, a kettle, and chicken blood. You see all this? They're making her look that it's all fiction, basically. He has Tituba sing her West Indian songs over a fire in the forest as a naked girl dance around. Sounded like a distant cousin of Mammy in Gone with the Wind. She says things like, Mr. Reverend, I do believe somebody else bewitching these children. She is last seen in a moonlit prison, sounding half crazed, begging the devil to carry her home to Barbados. After the crucible, she would be known for her voodoo. So after that movie, The Crucible, right? She would be known for her voodoo. That's when they hijacked your mind, made you shift your perception of this Indian indigenous woman, talking about she was practicing voodoo because they made her seem like she was African slave. They try to add that, they weren't saying it. They were calling her Negro, but they wanted you to think African, right? Of which there is no shred of evidence. Smithsonian.com is telling you straight up that there is no shred of evidence that she was practicing voodoo, rather than for her psychedelic confession, which endures on paper. Why the retrofitted racial identity? Arguably bias played a role. A black woman at the center of the story made more sense, in the same way that as Tituba's side, a man in black belonged at the center of a diabolical conspiracy. Her history was written by men working when African voodoo was more electrifying than outmoded English witchcraft. You hear this? It was written, it was not real, because her history was written by men working when African voodoo was more electrifying. It was more entertaining. It was more of the lies. It went with their lies than outmoded English witchcraft. All right, we're in the website history.com, or like from the History Channel or whatever. It says the mysterious slave who sparked Salem's witch hunt. Tituba has become a legend, but she was all too easy to scapegoat. They used her as a scapegoat. Right, it says here in history.com, Tituba's story is a convoluted and potentially fictitious as any other part of the Salem Witch Trials. Even during the events of the 1690s, which led to 20 deaths, legends and rumors were common, so they killed 20 people because of this. It's hard to untangle them from a distance, and all historians know for sure about Tituba comes from the court testimony she gave during the infamous trials. What is certain, pay attention right here, is that Tituba was a woman of color. That is certain, my people. Alright, so this indigenous woman, it's certain that she was a woman of color, and likely an indigenous Central American, who was a slave in the house of Reverend Samuel Parris, Salem's Puritan minister. At the time, slavery in the colonies was on the rise, and the West Indies was rapidly becoming Europe's most important center for the slave trade. And we remember, this is Indians. Reverend Samuel Parris bought Tituba in Barbados, where she had been enslaved since her capture during the childhood. He brought her to Massachusetts in 1680 when she was a teenager. At some point, she is thought to have married another slave named John Indian. Alright, remember he was the one calling her auntie, and she had a daughter, Violet. However, it was all too easy to scapegoat people of color. It was too easy for them to blame a so-called Negro, an American indigenous woman, and marginal members of society. Sarah Good, who was arrested along with Tituba, was a beggar who was looked down on by the town for her financial instability and her debts. You see what they did? They made her confess to people that they wanted to get rid of. They wanted to kill, really, or get rid of from the town. Straight up. Sarah Osborne lived on Salem's margins too. She was involved in a dispute with her children over their dead father's estate and was reviled for an affair with an indentured servant, an Indian. All three women were perfect targets for accusations of deviant evil, even evil behavior. Continues saying she was indicted as detestable witch and languished in jail for more than a year. Paris refused to pay her bail. Meanwhile, more and more indictments and arrests piled up as Salem gave into the town-wide panic. You see that? They were just killing people they wanted to get rid of. Used her as a scapegoat, an American indigenous woman. Later, Tituba recanted. She told the magistrate that she had made up everything after her master beat her in an attempt to force a confession. So who did she tell? Her magistrate. Remember the other guy? Calef? He interviewed her for his book. Now, this is another source, another person she told the same thing to, her magistrate. This is history.com. It's not just in that book. It's not just that guy making it up. All right? He beat her in an attempt to force a confession. By then, the trials had wound down and the governor of Massachusetts had ordered the arrest to stop. Eventually, an anonymous person paid Tituba's bail, and she went free after 13 months in jail. All right, continuing the book. Now, this part talks about how in these census records, right, that these slaveholders had, or when they listed their servants or slaves, they put the Indians at the end of these lists, right? So in the same list where the so-called Negroes were, or Negro list, what they called, or Negro slaves, they would always put the Indians at the end. So it says here, it is significant that these names all appear at the end of the list of Negro slaves in the usual manner of indicating Indians, but without the distinguishing label. Tituba name appearing at the end of the 1676 Thompson Schedule of Boys and Girls may reflect this same common practice. The absence of the designation Indian does not prove that a particular slave was African, even though listed under the rubric of Negroes. Alright, so they're saying that he's letting you know, right? This book is letting us know what we already know. That when they're talking about Negroes or Negroes being brought up from the West Indies, right? It doesn't automatically mean that he was an African just because he was listed as a Negro. Okay? Godwin noted that the words Negro and slave had become synonymous by 1680. All slaves, regardless of ethnic background, could be listed as Negroes. During the last quarter of the century, so even if you weren't a Negro, you were listed as you were a slave. Slaveholders no longer considered it necessary to distinguish their Indian slaves from the Africans. Nonetheless, the location of a name at the end of the list where American Indians were usually noted, coupled with a reference to the American locale known to be the source of Indian slaves at the time, thus provide verification that a particular slave was of Indian rather than of African origin, okay? Was of Indian rather than of African background. It is very likely then that the Tituba of the 1676 Thompson deed was an Amerindian. The name is too reminiscent of the Tetebetana clan to be discounted, whether spelled as Tetebe or Tituba or Tatuba. It is a name that appears to be uniquely American Indian, derivative and not African. For the merchant Predux, the quiet sale of this Amerindian girl to an unmarried merchant in need of an experienced domestic servant, and who was relocating to the mainland, would have made good sense and have been a relief to his neighbors. The Tituba inherited by Samuel Thompson was probably the same person as Tituba that Samuel Parris brought to Massachusetts and who figured so prominently in the early phases of Salem witch scare of 1692. He had come originally from an Arawak-speaking group in South America, an area that formed part of what was vaguely identified as the Spanish Main. Tituba's behavior in Salem suggests nothing to the contrary, but rather supports these conjectures regarding her ethnic background. Paris' Indian woman was, therefore, no more than 30 years of age in 1692, and possibly as young as 25. She carried with her memories of life in an Arawak village as well as the image of an emergent Creole society in the Barbados of the 1670s. All right, now we're in the website. It's called Last Real Indians. All right, the Last Real Indians. All right, .com. Check it out. The unknown Native American Amerindian slave trade and the hidden Native American Amerindian ancestry in Barbados and the Barbados and Guyana Locono Arawak origins of the infamous Salem Witch Trials by Damon Corey. All right, it says here 1674, Captain Peter Robb set sail from Barbados on his ship, the Savoy, for the Dutch Guiana coastline in South America. He had a legal mandate from Barbados English Governor Lord Willoughby and his successor in 1673, Sir Peter Culleton, to capture Arawak Indians for sale in Barbados. Alright, Indians, not Africans. In this same year, the Barbadian English colonist settlers of the Carolinas were also enslaving the Sawi and Appalachian tribes and exporting them to Barbados for the Amerindian slave market. Alright, again, American Indians, not Africans. Now, it says here, 1675, Samuel Parris, who owned a successful sugar plantation in Barbados, as did his brother Thomas Parris, purchased two Lacano Arawak Indians, one older female and one younger male, that were captured together the year before by Captain Peter Robb's slave raiding expedition to the Guianas. He renamed them both as John Indian for the male and Tituba for the female. Alright, what does that tell us? Tituba. This is the woman so often misrepresented as an African slave in the fanciful retelling of the infamous Salem Witch Trials. Alright, misrepresented as an African slave. She's an indigenous aborigine. We'll see that. I can even tell you a fact that the people who want to portray her erroneously as an African woman do not know, namely that Tituba means the same as auntie. Tituba means the same as auntie in the Lacono Arawak language, and Paris assumed this was her name because the younger Arawak man he purchased, who was captured with her on the coastline in Guyana, was either her actual blood nephew or merely any younger male in the tribe, who, as was custom, and still is in our tribe, would refer to her with this term of endearment only, and never by her real name, for that would be the height of disrespect. Hence he heard John referring to her as Tituba incessantly, and Paris logically concluded, since he was not a speaker of the Lacono Arawak language, that her name must be Tituba. Case closed. Alright, so what is she? An Arawak Indian, right? He's saying Lacono Arawakan, and Tituba is a Arawakan word close to showing a relation in a family, like auntie, somebody older, somebody they respect. Alright, so a lot of the Caribbean people, you guys know this. You call your family members auntie, right? Alright. Continues says 1680, Samuel Parris immigrated to Boston, Massachusetts, USA with his family and the two Arawak Indian slaves he purchased 5 years earlier in Barbados. 1689, the now Reverend Samuel Parris moved to Salem and founded his own Puritan church. It says here, 1692, Reverend Samuel Parris discovers his female Arawak Indian slave Tituba performing a ritual, what I recognize as merely a traditional Lokono Arawak purity rite of passage, since my own daughter had one done for herself by her grandmother and mother when she was 13. So you see, because they said that they caught her doing some witchcraft, all right, something with a cake, all right, but he knows what it is. This person who is actually Lakono Arawak, right, tribal person, says, seems like it was a traditional Lakono Arawak puberty rite of passage, and it is the most sacred and important ceremony for a young female that takes her from girlhood to womanhood. For his daughter Elizabeth, his niece Abigail, and two other of their friends, Ann Putnam and Elizabeth Hubbard. All right, that was the girls who were living with her. All right, so we're in this website called Lacono Caribe System. All right, it says Arawak, Azteca, and Inca prayers and other orisons for faith keepers. All right, just found something interesting here. All right, so it starts breaking down about languages and how certain words are Native American and all that. And then it starts getting into Tituba, right? And it says an example comes to us from the dubious notoriety assumed and projected by historians onto Tituba, an Arawak slave woman who is said to have come perhaps from Barbados, though originally from Guyana, or Guyana, South America, land of the blacks, right? Guyana, land of Negroes. Her story shows what we can acknowledge as early fake news, all right? Because they started throwing the African in there, all right? So it says here, let's decipher and locate a meaning for her name to honor this grandmother who was stolen and became lost to her family and people group. Most native names were lost with Christianization due to being falsely categorized as be pagan. In Bennett's dictionary, there's only Titi, term of respect for an older woman, which may well be borrowed from Spanish, Portuguese, or French, and perhaps indicates she was over 30 and perhaps over 40. The ba suffix meaning your. Tituba would mean your aunt. Tituba means your aunt, like we just got from the other article, or auntie, a general term of respect across the native peoples who have the sense of extended family identity. All right, so Tituba means auntie. All right, so John was calling her Tituba, John Indian, right? Supposedly her husband, but he was actually calling her auntie. All the same, Bennett's other meaning for the Titi is ichi, unconnected with teta, aunt, in Old Spanish and Old Portuguese, which becomes contracted into tia, tia, tutua, tia, ta. Her name might be a surname from the Kahu Baba or Kahuvaba tribe, or it might be something like Ketuwa, Ketuwa, a wa, the light hibiscus flower. Tetua became folklorized as black. She became folklorized as black. What does that mean? All right, so-called black. Today's meaning is any African blend of mix, which today, like she's saying, would uh, tell people right? With their hijack mentality of history, that she has to be African, right? Because she's labeled black today. All right. Yet black in English originally, though, was used to describe any person or people group who were non-Anglo-Saxons, non-Anglo-Saxons, or those said to be of unsavory heart of character. All the same, in the earlier years in Spanish, negrita or negrito, little black one, was used as a term of endearment, leading us today to recognize that one time black marked a cherished characteristic of being dark-haired or dark-complexioned and associated perhaps with the era of Ottoman rule in parts of Spain, or the unusual and exotic, as in the biblical poetry of the Songs of Solomon, also known as canticos. I am black, but calmly, O ye daughters of Jerusalem. All right, so look at this. What is Solomon telling you? That he is black, right? So-called black. And he didn't say that because he's most likely speaking Paleo Hebrew. I'm sure he didn't say black, but he's telling people his complexion, dark skin, in this verse in the Bible. Did you know that? All right, so Tituba says became the first American native woman of these intercontinental Americas to be falsely accused of the Euro-American practice of brujeria. Any woman whose knowledge, gifts, and talents surpassed or was inscrutable to any man or men was typically, in the history of British colonial life, one that was feared as pagan because she knew how to heal and had ancient American native knowledge, right, that she was bringing up, which they saw as pagan practices, right, in witchcraft or Wiccan, evil, or otherwise criminalized by those who falsely imagined that what they did not understand must be dangerous. All right, so this is going to correlate what we were reading about the word Tituba and Auntie. All right, so this says the planter in Barbados may also have been encouraged to call the slave by that shortened form of her tribal family name if the girl had followed Arawak custom and refused to reveal her proper name to him. Such proper names expressed an identity not only in the form but in essence, and were seldom used by Guiana Indians for fear that the identity could be lost if the name were revealed to outsiders. Arawak groups usually addressed each other by relationships using the word for brother, sister, companion, or mother, rather than their given names, or auntie. Since relationships with Europeans were not always definable, Indians accepted whatever terms was suggested to them by the strangers. Thus, it was not unusual to hear Indians dubbed Peter, Jack, John, or Mary. Whatever her proper name was, Tituba would have refused to disclose it to her kidnappers, but may have revealed that she was Tete Betado, a female of the Tete Betana clan. To call her Tetebe would also have the convenience of identifying her origin or point of embarkation, making a racial tag or a surname unnecessary. The name Tituba, then, is probably a shortened form for one of the clans or families. You hear this? So it's kind of related to what we were reading earlier, right? About auntie or family, a relation, showing a relation or respect, showing somebody of respect, right? The Tete Betana of an Arawak-speaking group located in the Amakura Orinoco River area, a section of the world called by Europeans the Spanish Main. All right, so this is kind of correlating where we were talking about the whole, the word meaning auntie or showing some kind of family relation or tribal relation. All right, so John was calling her Tituba,